A very good evening to all of you. Today we would be discussing about answer writing for UPSC mains. Our topic of discussion today is how saline farming can be an exact solution for the issue of food security in India. So in this session we would understand how would you write a UPSC answer if you are given a topic how saline farming can be an apt solution to address the growing or the burgeoning food security issues in India. What can be the structure, what can be the content, and what can be the presentation? Those three things we would focus for today, right? So we would start with, first of all, the knowledge which is required for answering this question. The second important thing is the structure of the answer. And the third important thing is the presentation of the answer. A lot of students say we would have an introduction, conclusion and body. No, we don't go by that. Okay. So what we go by is mainly the content, right? So beginning with the problem. Now, as I said, how saline farming can address the issue of food security in India. The first thing we need to highlight is, why is India facing a food security? That's the first question. The second question we would address is, what are the solutions that saline farming can provide and the benefits. Now, when you would talk about benefits, you would have to bring into account what are the reasons for food insecurity in India. So that's another important thing that we would understand here. Then you can bring certain statistics, certain facts and figures that would substantiate your answer and explain why saline farming can be a perfect solution. Finally, you can bring in global case studies. You can talk about the best crops that can be grown and the changing crop patterns, right? So these are the things that we would consider while talking about the issue of saline farming and how it can address the food security. In the meanwhile, if any of you have any points of discussion or suggestions or feedback, definitely post those in the comment section. I'll take those as we proceed with the lecture. So the first thing we need to understand here is, the first thing that I would explain here is why India is facing food security. Now, three important reasons we would cite. The first reason here is the rising population pressure. The second is rising population pressure leading to shortage of food, an increase in degraded land, or the land which is not fit for agriculture. So non-arable land, we can say, is rising. The third important point that we must mention here is climate change. Now, what's happening because of climate change? Because of climate change, the sea levels are rising. With the rising sea level, there is a lot of coastal indentation in the region. Now, this is one of the basic reasons why a lot of land is no more suitable for agriculture purpose, right? So that's another important reason that we need to take into account. So three important factors that we have understood why food security issues in India are rising. Now, parallel to this, we would understand the idea of bringing in saline farming. How saline farming can address this issue? The first issue is the rising population pressure. That means we need to increase our arable land. Now, definitely the land that a country has is fixed. You cannot increase that size of land. So what you can bring in is the land which is not suitable for agriculture into agriculture. So bringing in non-arable land into the ambit of arable land, that's a perfect idea here. So that's one of the things that can be done. The second important thing to address is bring in a kind of farming which is sustainable year round. So bring in techniques which are sustainable throughout the year. Also, how the water which is saline can be used for irrigation. That's another important thing that you can address here. Now, considering all this, what we need to understand, if, let me bring some facts and figures here. So, if, let's say, saline farming is introduced, what would happen? The areas which are highly susceptible, those areas could be best utilized. I give you a very simple example to quote here. Let's say numerous areas where you have monsoon. Now what would happen in the monsoon? When it rains, the salt percolates deep into the water, and as a result, the salinity of the soil is maintained. But there are regions, specific regions. What regions can we cite? We can cite regions of North Africa, let's say Mid East. Then we have Gulf of Kutch in India. All these areas are the areas where monsoon does not leach the salt. That means the salt does not percolate deep into the waters. Now, deep underground, if the salt does not percolate, that would lead to increase in salinity on the surface. Now, if there is increase in the salinity on the surface, this land would become non-arable, not usable for cultivation. So, if this kind of land is brought into the idea of agriculture, it could be a possibility that 70 to 120 million hectares of land can be brought into cultivable land, into arable land, right? So a significant amount can be brought into cultivable land. Very, very important to understand. The next is, if I go by a simple fact, I would let you know that let's say 1% of fresh water which is available to us. We have covered this in the NCERT series on geography as well. So we have just 1% of fresh water. Of this 1% fresh water, you might be surprised that 70% is utilized for the purpose of agriculture. With rising population, definitely there is more need for human consumption for fresh water. That cannot be substituted. So what we can substitute is probably the agriculture for fresh water. Now when I say I want to substitute agriculture for fresh water, what can be done? This 1% water, if it is utilized or if it is conserved, this 1% water, if it is conserved, can be utilized for human consumption. So that's one side of it. The other side is, let's look into the figures for saline water. If I talk about the groundwater in percentage, we have 0.76% of groundwater which is fresh, 0.9% of groundwater which is saline, 0.007% of water in the lakes which is fresh, and 0.006% of the waters in the lakes which is saline. So if I incorporate both the ground fresh water and the lake fresh water, still I have a higher proportion for only the groundwater saline which is present. That means if this groundwater which is saline is utilized, we can have enormous possibilities for cultivation. So how we can utilize the saline water is important. There have been numerous experiments done globally. Now as I said, we'll bring in the global picture. So globally, if I talk about countries like Bangladesh, where a lot of seawater indentation has been taking place, in that case we have witnessed that salt tolerant species have been grown, and these have been really successful. Another good example is Netherlands. Netherlands is also known as the land of polders or the polder land, where artificially the land is reclaimed. Now this artificial reclamation of land has led to activities like horticulture, Floriculture, exceptionally good in the regions of Netherlands, dairy industry. So those areas have been developed with salt tolerant species. Now, if we have seen globally this model has been successful, why not bring this model in India? We tried and we have brought this model in India in the region of Gulf of Kutch. So we are now experimenting with salt tolerant species that can be grown in the regions of Gulf of Kutch. Now, what kind of species grow well? If we broadly classify, there can be three major classifications. One is which go perfectly well in saline water. The other is which go moderately well in saline water. And the third one is which are very less modifiable with the salt water. For example, peas, beans. You need to have a lot to move forward in these crops. But yes, these are not the species that can grow in a salt-rich water. Salt-rich soil, sorry. So what are moderately tolerant species? I can say oats, rice, alfalfa as a fodder grass. These are some of the species which can moderately tolerate the salt atmosphere. The crops which can highly tolerate the soil, salty water or the salty soil are basically barley, rye, then we have crops like safflower, sunflower. Most of the coarse millets can grow well. Then we also have sugar beets. So probably we can have a new way of cultivation, moving from sugar canes to sugar beets. So sugar beets is a good substitute. Asparagus, again another crop that can be grown. Now, what all crops can be grown? When I talk about classification within the terms of crops, I can say I can have the crops which are used as which are used for edible purpose. I can have a broad classification here. The crops which have durable hardwood, so they can be used for fuel wood. Then there can be another category of crops that can be used for fodder. As I said, alfalfa is a good fodder crop. So alfalfa can be a good example here. We can have horticulture development. So flowering species can be grown. Then there are certain chemical species, that species like chemicals etc. can be extracted from the same soil. So soda etc. can be extracted. Now these are some of the things that we can take into account. The most important thing that we would understand here is this is the knowledge. Now this is a very basic knowledge that I have explained to you. Unless and until you have this depth, there is no point writing the answer. That's the first thing. So the most important thing while I am checking the answer copies these days, what I try to understand is most of the students lack the fundamental knowledge. The kind of concepts that we have discussed so far lead to the fundamental background knowledge. Even if you have been reading your GS thoroughly, you can attempt this question well. Given that you have to be very conversant with the fundamentals of geography. The second thing is the structure. So far we discussed knowledge. Now structure can take various forms. For example, as I mentioned, I can start with food security. I can move to climate change, then come on to saline farming. How saline farming can be a solution. Bring in certain statistics that actually substantiate the solution, and finally I can lay down the guidelines or the suggestive measures. Now suggestive measures can incorporate the facts like what all areas. I can have a simple map of India and I can say, okay, this is the area which is highly saline prone. This is the area where you have a lot of mangrove vegetation or mangroves. So probably these are the areas of saline soil, halophytes, where you can have good saline farming spots that can be grown. So there can be suggestive incorporations. we are also trying to bring in new cropping patterns. For example, India is giving thirst to bringing in palm oil. Importing palm oil from Indonesia getting expensive, so we need to have our indigenous production of palm oil. Now, when we are saying indigenous production of palm oil, let us check whether palm is a good crop which can be grown in a saline soil. If yes, it's a perfect crop that can be grown in the areas where so far there is no agriculture. So another point which can be done as a suggestive implementation. So this can be one of the structures or the framework. There can be other structures or the frameworks that you can incorporate, but this is just one idea that I have brought in. You can also start with the issue of explaining what saline farming is, how it is beneficial, how it supersedes the traditional agricultural practices, so how it supersedes the conventional farming patterns, and then you can bring in your views, suggestive views, and then finally address the issue that yes, if this is brought in, food security issues can be addressed. So there can be either ways you can proceed. There is no hard and fast one thumb rule that this is how you have to proceed for your answer writing. Clear? So this is one thing that we have discussed. The second thing is structure. The third thing, as I mentioned, is presentation. Now, in this structure, I forgot to mention we have talked about the global case studies. We did not incorporate that, but yes, we can, while giving the statistics or guidelines, we can explain the global case studies that we discussed. Now, the last and the most important thing is presentation. How would you actually bring your answer into the real world? Okay, so when you are bringing your answer, when you are presenting your answer, the most important thing that we have addressed here is the solutions as for saline farming. What could be the best solutions? Now, when you are presenting your answer should have a very systematic look. For example, let me start with the second way I explained you. So you start with saline farming is so and so. You explain about saline farming. Then you explain that with the rise on saline farming, so much million hectares of land could be brought into arable category. You can have a quick tabulation here. Explain this data is brought from XYZ source. If you remember the source, you can mention the source. And then explain the table that yes, this is groundwater, this is lakes, this is saline and freshwater component, and explain the values, right? Then you can explain together with the saline and the freshwater. Here is how the combined set could go, right? So this is a very important aspect under the first heading. Then come on to the issue of food security. Address how this saline farming can bring in the solution to food security. Why is food security a major cause, and what could be the suggestive measures if saline farming is brought, right? The third important thing would be bring in the case studies. So global case studies, mention it very clearly which case studies you are saying. Let's say Netherlands, and then if you are, let's say, bringing in Bangladesh or any emerging economy, bring that. Impact of monsoons and the region where there is lack of monsoon impact, in that region how this could be a substantial format. And finally, bring in suggestive measures. When you are bringing in suggestive measures, you can have a quick backdrop and explain the regions, as I mentioned, where this could be a successful model. You can overlap your map with other areas. Let's say you have drawn the regions which you say are suggestive for saline farming. You can overlap the areas. Okay, these would be the areas that would be for palm oil. So probably palm oil could be a suggestive measure under saline farming, or a possible crop that could be grown. This would bring in employment. Now bring in the benefits, right? The benefits would be, so far this region which was not arable, the people did not had good employment opportunities. So the first thing it would bring in employment. It would bring in fuel wood. It would increase the supply for fodder. So better fodder can be provided. to the animals, and then it would also reduce the impact on food insecurity. So food insecurity issues can be dealt with. That's the main thing that we had been discussing so far, but those are the benefits that can be brought out, right? And then we can also give some of the incidences from the recent happening. So recently we have seen the farmers have been shifting from wheat to other crops, and as a result there has been substantial reduce in the fodder content. This is one of the studies which had been released in the last Down to Earth edition, and because of which we have seen that the cost of the fodder for the farm animals has increased. Many of the people involved in animal husbandry are now leaving their cattle because they cannot sustain that cost. And if the fodder supply is increased, definitely animal husbandry can revive in India, and the rising prices of the dairy products could be controlled. So there can be various things that you can actually bring in the answer. So this was just a small discussion that we had. If you think about, you can have numerous viewpoints that can be brought. So as I mentioned, three important things: knowledge, the paramount thing. There is no big question besides that. If you don't have an in-depth knowledge, there is no point writing an answer. Practicing writing an answer should come only once you are thorough in that topic. Then lay out a structure, what all points you need to include, and finally the presentation, how would you bring your answer in. So this was a discussion for today. We would be meeting next Saturday again as a live session for more answer writing practices. Join us back, and if you have any questions, doubt, feel free to connect back directly to me. I am available on phone calls as well as through email. So feel free to connect and have a discussion wherever and whenever required. Also, relevant links are in the in the section below. So in the description below, you can check out the relevant links if you find those useful. Wish you very good luck. See you again. Have a wonderful day.